Hi, my name is Amani, Yousuf, and I'm back with the All Souls podcast. And today I'm here with Mr. Dunn, Instructional Director for Social Studies and World Language. And in this podcast, we discuss two philosophical, almost unanswerable questions from Oxford University's All Souls podcast, or All Souls College exam, which is known to be the hardest exam in the world because you're given these unanswerable questions. So without further ado, let's get started. And be sure to watch the previous 3 videos. The first question is globalization in retreat?
Okay, so globalization usually refers to interconnections and interdependencies of world economies, nations, cultures, and people. And I would guess that this question, is it in retreat, probably connects to an article in the Harvard Business Review by a guy by the name of Bruce Nussbaum, who coined a concept known as peak globalization. And what he essentially said was that globalization, which had really started during the Industrial Revolution, while it had grown more and more intense over time, the Great Recession of 2008 really marked the peak of that increasing interconnection and interdependence. And so Nussbaum talked about trade and how trade flows were shrinking, but other people who say that globalization is in retreat talk about global fragmentation, and they talk about the rise of economic nationalism, both of which are contrary to the concept of globalization. And globalization really refers to a future where the world is working together around common rules and common projects.
Okay, when I had to consider this question, my original question for myself was, if it's in retreat, what is that really asking? Because I sort of feel like, at least especially growing up in like today's day and age, that the definition of it has kind of always been the same, like the perception of it where everyone's interacting with each other, and then like the reality. I think obviously like throughout history the geopolitical tensions across the world have changed, but the same idea has stood where it's like a segregated idea, and I think I've noticed that the same countries tend to work together, and I feel like that hasn't changed that much. And I also wonder, I think things have gotten back to normal for the most part since COVID, but I actually don't think that with COVID, globalization took like a major downturn when I was doing a little bit of research. Do you think that could be compared to like the Great Recession of 2008?
So are you thinking of globalization in economic terms or political terms? Yeah, I don't know enough about trade flows to speak to that too much. But I will say that I think evidence that it's in retreat would be just the relationship between the United States and China, for example. Because, when I was your age, when I was in high school, one of the big debates was, should the U.S. give most favored nation trading status to China? And now they call that normal trade relations, which just meant free trade relations. And the debate at that time was from a perspective of the United States, is if you trade with China, if you have economic liberalization, is that economic liberalization going to lead to political liberalization? Is it going to lead to more democracy? And a lot of people who were proponents of the trade, the free trade, the economic liberalization, that was one of the ways they justified it. They said, we're not just doing this because it's going to increase our profits. We're going to do this because it promotes American values. But if you look at the world now, there's clearly pushback from China on that. And so this idea that China and the United States are engaged in these free relationships like they have been for decades, not free trade relationships, it's obviously not true. I mean, just in this weekend, you see the Biden administration talking about putting tariffs on electric vehicles from China because they're worried about the Chinese advantage in electrical vehicles and dumping those vehicles on American markets and what that would do to electric vehicles in this country. You see that with the CHIPS Act from the Biden administration, which is essentially trying to protect the microchip industry from the Chinese government and the Chinese military. And so the Chinese themselves have said that this liberal order benefits the United States and benefits the global West in an unfair way, and they're clearly pushing back against it. So I think while it was more globalized before, I think it's returning to more regional kind of arrangements now.
Yeah, that's actually, speaking of China and economic liberalization, when I was studying for the AP comparative government exam, they were talking, Miss Kairos always coins the phrase, I don't know if she coined the phrase, but as countries democratize, they economically liberalize, with the case of China. Because I know funny when there were a few phrases that everyone in the class would die laughing at, or like the NPC, because it like National People's Congress, it also stands for like NPC, non-player character.
Oh, I'm not a video game person.
I'm not a video game person either, but it means like kind of a person who's like irrelevant.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's a good joke. Yeah, I like that.
Do you have anything else you wanted to add for this one?
I'd just say it is in retreat. I think we've reached peak globalization, and I think that there have been a lot of benefits of the globalized system, and I think we'll miss some of those. Free trade makes everybody richer. Free trade leads to greater cooperation. There used to be a theory about the McDonald's theory of global affairs, which that if a country opened up a McDonald's, then it wouldn't go to war with another country that had a McDonald's. But that's no longer the case. In fact, since 2008, we're seeing that countries that have McDonald's do go to war with other countries that have a McDonald's. And so I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's a little frightening of what might be ahead.
Now we're going to move on to the second question, which Mr. Dunn also picked, and it's question 9. If Margaret Thatcher and Nelson Mandela had died on the same day, whose death should the BBC have reported as its top story?
Since you mentioned AP Comparative Government and Politics, I taught that course back in the day. So these are obviously 2 questions that would come up in that class quite a lot. All right, so our basics, Margaret Thatcher, she was the first female prime minister of Great Britain from 1979 to 1990. Margaret Thatcher was known for breaking the post-war consensus that the Conservative and Labour Party had come to following World War II. And that consensus was Keynesian economics, a commitment to a welfare state, nationalization of key industries, a promotion of, say, jobs over economic growth. And she, in the 70s, Britain was going through this recession, and so Thatcher basically came in and said, none of that's working. She was a big proponent of free trade, tax reductions, and then she was also very nationalistic and a Cold War warrior like Ronald Reagan. And then Nelson
besties, I know.
What's this? Yeah, they might have been, yeah, for sure. And then Nelson Mandela, born in 1918 in South Africa, an anti-apartheid activist, politician, statesman, became the first black president of South Africa in 1994. I was a junior in college at that time. 1 term in office, and he's probably known as much as anything for his commitment to reconciliation. So instead of trying to use this position, this office of power, with all this power to kind of punish the white South Africans, he thought it was important to bring truth to what apartheid was like, but that people should try to work together to create a multi-ethnic, multi-racial democracy. So do you know what year they died?
Yes, 2013.
2013?
I think Mandela was December and Thatcher was April, I want to say.
That's right.
But
so they died in the same year.
Yes.
You're exactly right.
Yes.
And so you can see why Oxford would be thinking of this. But also the BBC's coverage was really controversial. You know this too?
Okay, I don't know about that, but I was just taking a look because if I had to answer this question objectively, I would probably have to say, since it's the BBC, Margaret Thatcher. But then after my time as a student journalist and just seeing I will say it's obviously like impacted by students from like Forest High School who subscribe to certain stories over others. It is interesting to see which ones are viewed the most and which ones people are moved by the most. And so I think those are always the ones where the person, if it's like a profile, for example, like the person that's being written about has touched the hearts and souls of other people. And so for that reason, I'm like compelled to say Nelson Mandela, but I think objectively speaking, maybe Margaret Thatcher. But since when I had to think about this question, I wanted to look at the BBC specifically, and I wondered, once I found out that they died in the same year, which is obviously why they chose this question, especially since I think this question set was from 2015, so it's not
Makes
that much
sense,
longer after. I wanted to see like what the coverage would look like and see like the differences in quotes from like figures that like were close to Mandela or close to Thatcher, and also just like a list of their accomplishments. And I read through like the each piece about like the deaths of both, but then I wanted to look at more closely, so I looked at the obituaries. And it was really interesting. I thought that Mandela's was going to be this really long one, like talking about his legacy, and it definitely got into that. But I feel like it was actually way more detailed for Thatcher, but still in a way that was like far off, not like she definitely was like a crueler leader, and I think it's also like maybe exaggerated because she was a woman and had to like have the whole, I think she was trying to maintain the housewife politician while also like getting things done, whether you loved her or you hated her. And so I was actually surprised when the one about Mandela was really moving and really compelling, because it talked about how he lost his father at age 9, and since then was like inspired to become who he was when he passed away. But the one about Thatcher just talked about like everything she did and its impact on just the UK, whereas everything that Mandela did had a global impact, even if it was just like specific with apartheid to South Africa. So I also think now most people, like if you were to talk to an average high school student, they'd probably know who Nelson Mandela is, and they might not know who Margaret Thatcher is. But at the time, I think it should be Margaret Thatcher, but I think it would also be hard if they did die on the same day. You'd have half the world be like, why is this not either? No matter what happens, you'll have half the world be like, why didn't you cover the opposite person that you selected?
Interesting. So the coverage of BBC of Thatcher was criticized by other newspapers. They said that the BBC was too biased, that they were emphasizing all the people who didn't like Thatcher. They said the BBC had it out for her. And so they'd interview the miners who had their union crushed by Thatcher, and they complain, that Thatcher ruined their livelihoods. Or they'd interview people in poor neighborhoods, and they would really emphasize the worst about her. If I'm not mistaken, they spent days covering Mandela's passing, like days. And
the ending was really cool though, because it talked about how there was like 2 points at the end where they said I think he had 3 wives throughout his lifetime, but like the one around like 1994 when he was in power, I think he had just divorced his second wife, I want to say, and they were said that was like the point they wanted to highlight, that he was like really sad, and then they had a positive experience with him at the end when he like had just gotten out of jail. And also another thing, I don't know any other figure who was behind bars for 27 years and then became president. I think it's
impressive. It's inspiring.
Really inspiring. So there's also that I think is moving for a younger generation. And speaking of younger generations, I could see how like the BBC people would be upset with it, who were more like pro Thatcher. But they did talk about how she was kind of all about like people thinking like that the government has to do everything for you, to supply to get you through school, get you up on your feet. And they had a quote where she was like, "That's not my job," which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, she's got a lot of great quotes.
Yeah. And great hair.
As I hear your answer, I think about the different criteria you're developing to make a judgment about Thatcher. And so one of your criteria you were talking about is what is the role of a news organization. You started out with the Force Scout, and I think you were talking about how getting clicks or what would move people emotionally. That could be one role of a news organization. On the other hand, if you look at them, they say our role is to inform, educate, to represent diverse views. And then, you talked about the audience, you talked about younger people. Their audience, I kind of lean in the way you do actually about Thatcher, just because the BBC's main audience is Britons. And yes, South Africa became a British colony, and yes, Thatcher played an important role in international pressure, being brought to bear against the apartheid regime. Britain had a crucial role in that. But I think when you talk about audience, that's an important question. I do think because it's BBC, because it's a public broadcasting corporation, because their audience is the Brits, I do think you'd probably put her at the top, whereas just about any other publication in the world, I would put Mandela on the top. So the other things you were talking about too, and was reminding me of how historians, how we would think about what makes an event historically significant. So you know, who was more prominent at the time? What was the magnitude of the impact? You were talking about the depth of feeling. That's an important thing when you think about whether someone's significant historically. The scope, how many people were influenced, and then the duration of time, like over time, and then finally, what does each character reveal about the society that they're part of? So you're thinking through all those criteria, and those were some of the same I was wrestling with. But at the end of the day, I thought about BBC News and their target audience, and I would probably choose Thatcher as well.
Yeah, I think if you had to make the tough decision, it'd probably be wisest to do Thatcher, but I think it'd be hard for me not to do Mandela. But I see, obviously, you have to make tough decisions. But I also was thinking, I had this a long time ago. I had this conversation with my dad. I can't remember how it came up, but I was talking about just what certain things in the U.S. would mirror modern day slavery and the effects. And he was like, interestingly enough, I actually think that the UK and South Africa are way more racist than the United States. And I was really interested by why he had to say that. And it makes me think, I've read a few different books about discrimination racially in the U.S. But the only one I really read about South Africa is Cry the Beloved Country, which I read in Mr. Fergus's English class freshman year by Alan Payton. And it was some of the books I've read throughout high school. I'd be lying if I said that they were terrible to get through. This one was really, really moving and really engaging, especially for someone who just felt like they had to get the assignment done at times versus actually enjoy it, which is I think why I ended up taking AP Lit, because I found that some books you might not enjoy, but others, the vast majority that we read in AP Lit, I loved. But it makes me think that I think the whole point of Alan Payton's argument, or I guess message in the story, was the irony and the tragedy behind the irony of, in the book, I don't know if, are you familiar with it?
No, I have not read it.
Yeah, a white activist dies by, okay, so the book is about this main character who is a fairly religious person. He goes to find his son Absalom, which is a biblical reference. And Absalom was trying to make it through the lives of Johannesburg, and he accidentally shoots and kills a white activist who was monumental in ending apartheid. This happened, I think it was published in 1940 or 48, so it was towards the beginning. But it was really sad, because imagine you killed one of the people who's trying to help you. And it makes me think in comparison, Alan Payton later on became an anti-apartheid activist. It makes me wonder what the differences would be between that and MLK Jr. So if you say the US had to cover something that was if MLK Jr. died and Lyndon B. Johnson died on the same day, who would you feel compelled to write about?
It's a provocative question.
Yeah. So I wonder, I did some digging on a while ago on MLK Jr. I found out that obviously you're never supposed to meet your heroes or your idols, because they are people too with secrets. And I was a little bit disappointed to see find out what I found out, I guess. But he still gave his I Have a Dream speech, and to the vast majority of people had a big impact on ending discrimination. So I think it would be flipped. I feel if you were to cover it, but it's hard to say because it's, again, a U.S. president.
Right.
But, so I don't know. It's interesting how it's a fairly similar situation, except obviously Thatcher is from a different country than Mandela. Right. Yeah. But I almost feel I'd want to say MLK. But at that time, given it being in the 60s, I would assume that they would cover Lyndon B. Johnson as the main story.
Yeah, I don't know. That was before my time, believe it or not. But listening to your answer, I'm thinking of other lenses that you're applying to this that I think are really important lenses. And it seems to me what you want to do is you want to apply a moral lens to this. And so, there's this theory called moral foundations theory that says that in a Western society, people, they value things like liberty, and they value things like tradition and authority, but they also value equality and care and fairness. And so, sometimes I think when I ask some people randomly today this question, most people are saying Mandela, of course, is what they were saying. And I think they were saying that primarily because they think his fight for justice and his fight for human rights is so important, and that he had a singular impact on South Africa. And I think for a lot of them, you look at Thatcher and say, yeah, incredibly charismatic woman.
Yeah.
But did she have that same singular impact? If Margaret Thatcher had not been prime minister, could someone like John Major have done similar things? Didn't have quite the personality. But I guess my point is, applying the moral lens would lead you to a different conclusion.
About people have no idea what it's like to actually run a country. I think also Mandela had a task at hand about ending a specific thing that was harming certain people and their civil rights and within South Africa for black people versus white people, whereas Thatcher just, obviously there was internal domestic turmoil within the country, but it wasn't to the degree of racial discrimination in South Africa. So it's easy to praise someone for being so impactful when they were given such a horrible thing to try and deal with, whereas Thatcher just had to run a government with specific problems that were really important at the time. So that's also I do think I would praise Mandela for everything he's done, but I also have to acknowledge that, and I'm not defending Thatcher or anything because I honestly can't. I don't know her and what she's done that well.
I don't want to get too meta here about this whole thing, but so I think the conversation's a good one because I think we're trying to think critically through these questions, and I think when Oxford's asking these questions, you need to have some background information about it. First of all, you need to have some framework, some criteria to judge what's going on, and you need to then have the right habits of mind. And so I think this format is really cool for that.
Thank you so much. And as always, keep asking questions and stay curious.